Hello and welcome to the InnoFrontier podcast. It is my pleasure to have our very first podcast with one of the most forward-thinking people that I know and one of the best friends that a guy could have, and that's Peter West, CEO of Qualiti. Peter, thank you so much for being here.
Thank you.
For anybody listening, I've actually known you since I was 11, I believe. I think that you moved in to be my neighbor when you were 9. Is that right?
Yeah, that sounds about right. Thanks.
So 9 years old, do you want to maybe take us through a little bit about what led you to be interested in technology generally? And then we're kind of walk through your career a little bit and of course talk a little bit about Qualiti, but tell us a little bit about, what first interested you in technology? What were some of the technologies that you first started playing around with?
Yeah, I think I've been interested in technology for as long as I can remember, and even a little bit longer because I have some printer paper sketches where I took my dad's old, like it was like thicker stock that he had because apparently that was what the printer used at the time. I've drawn out these inventions on there, rolled those up, and I found those a couple decades later. But just something I think I've always, even from as a 5 or 6 year old or whatever that was, been very interested in technology I just find it fascinating, just the fun side of it aspect. But also, my dad's an entrepreneur in the tech space. He's done a lot of smart home startups, and watching that, seeing the the experimentation that happened with that, and smart home devices have come a long way since the early 90s. But seeing that and growing up with that, I think also probably had a big impact, both in my interest in technology as well as starting to look at that from a business perspective as well.
How much was seeing your dad being an entrepreneur, how much did that affect your future decisions?
That's a good question. Because all of my siblings, it firmly convinced them not to be an entrepreneur. And despite his best efforts, he was unable to convince me of that. And I think it's just something that I inherently would enjoy. And I knew that was a career option by watching that. So, obviously had a big influence there. But I think the most important part was knowing that I had a good mentor to be able to do that.
At what point was it that you started playing around? So, your dad was a hardware engineer. You've really moved into being a software, he's a hardware entrepreneur, but you've really moved into being a software engineer and entrepreneur. When was the first time you started playing around with computers?
Oh, I don't. Playing around with computers beyond just like what everyone does. I took a computer repair class in high school, and then I started also trying to learn some basic programming stuff. Didn't do too much with it, honestly, because life was busy, and kind of wish I'd done a little more then. Would have certainly made the college side of that a little easier when I started looking at computer science. But I actually started in mechanical engineering, which I think is still something I find fascinating. But anyway, different story there.
And take me through kind of going from mechanical. Why did you, settle in on computer engineering as opposed to any of the other engineering disciplines?
Yeah, so there's a few things with mechanical that make it less appealing to me from a career perspective. One, it is a harder route to entrepreneurship. Computer science, you can write your own code and start your business based on that. But also, mechanical engineering moves slower. Software, you can iterate really quickly. Anyway, all those pieces were coming together, and I ended up deciding, hey, I'm going to look for, is there a hybrid option? And I actually went to electrical engineering first. And while doing some of the electrical engineering sort of prereqs and stuff, I ended up deciding to take some computer science classes and ended up switching my major there. Though I didn't end up finishing that either. I left with like 3 classes left. So, yeah.
What was the academic, value of studying computer science in college versus practical application? Like, what would you say is the balance there that you kind of need to be a software developer?
That is a good question. While I was in college, the program at the time their program has been changed a lot, but at the time, it was fairly outdated, honestly. I had a professor tell me, "You'll never use this, but I don't want to learn the new stuff." Uh, so, in terms of like learning the latest technology, it probably wasn't very valuable. Anything that I've ever used, I learned on my own outside of school. Um, but learning a lot of the, we'll say, programming fundamentals in terms of, I mean, even just understanding how little changes in code make a huge difference in performance. Or, one of my favorite classes, and maybe this fits because I came from, I liked mechanical and then electrical. One of my favorite classes was understanding how you go from, this hardware, how that creates these, electrical circuits, and you eventually end up with the binary code, and how binary code can eventually become, these electrical gates become ones and zeros, which become eventually assembly code, and suddenly C seems like this incredible, amazing thing rather than this old, outdated thing you wouldn't want to use. That class was fascinating. And sorry, I forgot the original question.
Well, just, the value of studying it in college versus, the practical applications. And I think you
Right.
answered that pretty well. So you started working in college, actually in technology. Tell us a little bit about how that happened and what that first job was like.
Yeah. So I I'd known I'd wanted to work at a startup, um, and I was looking at a new startup that was forming. And my dad was going to be, initially his plan was to be an advisor for the startup. He ended up getting more involved later. But I told him I wanted to work there. And he is generally not a fan of that because he doesn't like anything that could look like nepotism. Um, but after, you know, weeks, maybe months of wearing him down and threatening to join an insurance company, which he really didn't want me to do, he finally decided to let me come work there. And it was an awesome experience because it was a very early start, right? No product, nothing. Like we were starting from scratch, going through market research, going through, I did a lot of, it was in the healthcare IT space, which I learned a lot about, enough to know that I never want to go back. But yeah, it was a great introduction to startups from start all the way through the point where, we had customers and we were trying to deal with supporting them. And uh, I got to help on a lot of areas from the product management through, I did a little bit of coding, really not very much, and a decent amount of QA as well, which was fitting for kind of what came later.
Yeah. So tell me a little bit about that. So, you're working at this, healthcare IT startup doing a whole bunch of stuff, including QA, and then tell us about kind of that next step.
Yeah, so I started at that place. I think it was like early 2014, um, and in 2015 there was a huge earthquake in Nepal, and it was, I think, like an 8.2 magnitude earthquake, and these homes that have been around for, I mean, some of the structures there had been around for, a couple thousand years. They obviously weren't built to earthquake standards. The devastation in Nepal was huge, and they just didn't have the infrastructure to respond. Long story short, we actually went with my family on a humanitarian trip to just help rebuild the school, because a lot of the aid dollars weren't actually ending up getting to these communities. So we went in with Choice Humanitarian to do that, and ended up meeting a lot of very talented individuals. Nepal is a surprising place in many ways. The English is very good, but also the education is very good. It was based on the British education system, and they've done a great job with that. And I started talking to, out in this village in the middle of nowhere, I started talking to a guy that was around my age, probably a little younger, and he asked me if I liked Angular or React better. If you look around this village, you're on the side of the mountain. It's all like terraced farming. A little like 4-year-old walks by herding a yak. You're like, I mean, it looks like nothing's changed there in thousands of years. And this guy is talking about Angular and React, and you're like, how do you even know what that is? Um, and it turns out it's a very well-educated country in many ways, but also a very poor country. They don't have, or they didn't have, a large IT infrastructure. And being landlocked by India and China, weren't a lot of opportunities. Long story short, well, I guess shorter than I already made it, is we decided we wanted to try to help the economy of Nepal, and in particular, like the people there, so that they didn't have to continue to leave the country, go work in the Middle East in construction, that kind of a thing. And so we started a benefit-oriented offshore development shop. Rather than just being a normal dev shop, we wanted to have a niche, and that niche ended up being QA, where we said, look, we can have people with computer science degrees, with masters of computer science degrees, very technical people that can do software quality assurance work, and really help teams in the US, more of a staff augmentation model, like joining those teams, becoming part of their teams remotely. But that was how we ended up forming Seva Development. And as you know, because you were there with me on that journey, over the course of almost 7 years, we were able to grow that, and had a lot of fantastic experiences working with a lot of tech companies, from small startups through public companies with Microsoft. So really great experience.
When you first showed up in Nepal to actually start the company, can you tell us a little bit about that first trip?
The first trip was a little bit of an interesting ride because, well, I guess this was broken into two. We went on one trip out there that was sort of exploratory, where we went to a bunch of colleges, and even some of the high schools in the local community where we were going to put our first office, and just interviewed a ton of people. Just did a bunch of interviews and said, look, we're starting this company, and here's what this is going to be. And had a lot of interest, and we basically said, great, I'm going to come back in a month and a half on this date. We're going to start, and we're going to meet here, and we're going to go forward with that. And a day before that start date was supposed to happen, the person originally who was going to run that ended up deciding that wasn't the right fit for them. So last minute, a few hours to prepare before running to catch a flight out to Kathmandu, and that was a fun time. But it really was kind of cool, because it was, initially 20 people. We all just showed up at this office that was empty. Everyone's unboxing chairs, and we're all setting this up together, and it was a fun way to start.
No, for sure. Um, Tell us a little bit about that transition from, tech and product to CEO. What was that transition like for you?
Yeah. I recently heard something from Elon Musk that is kind of depressing, but he basically said, like, being a CEO can be terrible because nobody brings the small problems to you. It's basically every time there's a problem that is large enough that other people don't want to deal with it, or don't have what they necessarily need to deal with it, that's when it gets to you. So the CEO just deals with all the problems. And that kind of is how that transition happened. Was I went from, our first couple of customers, really focusing on, are we providing the right service for these customers, and focused on, the technology side of it, too. As problems arose, started dealing more and more with those rather than the technology. And so it was sort of a transition I was forced into, rather than a transition that just was made consciously. But it was a good thing, because I've learned that there are much better engineers than I am, much better at the, we'll say, conceptual side.
And taking what you accomplished at Seva Development and then being able to kind of pivot that to quality, can you kind of tell us about that product journey?
Yeah. So I mean, I mentioned that experience working with a lot of different tech companies. We worked with small engineering teams and very large engineering teams. The I mean, it sounds cliche. It's like, oh, we saw a problem, right? But it's like, the reality is, software testing can be a terrible experience almost anywhere you go. For the QA engineers, the issue is they're never going to have the resources they need. And you've got the product team saying, oh, we don't have time to just stop and wait for you to test for 2 days or whatever. And you've always got the salespeople, marketing people, executives, whoever it is, wanting more features out faster. So there's just like a natural tension point there. Looking at that, we started saying there's just got to be a better way, because you need to know you didn't break something when you push it out, but the current model is just not working, right? And being the technology nerd that I was enjoying following, the AI space, and have been for a while. And when GPT-2 came out, it was like, oh, this is incredible. We've got to do something with this, right? And so we started playing around with that, and you know, we tried a number of different approaches. Even did a little project with BYU, on some research there. We ended up deciding to go a very different direction than they did in the end. Difference in the focus on a paper versus a product. But that when we started to see promising results there, that's when we made the decision, hey, this really has the potential to make the difference we're looking for. And that's when we started the process of, finding new management for our consulting company, as well as, starting to build out this team to build quality into what it is today.
When you look at the, you know, quality and what it's becoming, can you tell us a little bit about where quality is today and about where quality is kind of going into the future?
Quality is definitely still early. We launched with customers very recently. We just raised a seed round and actually just looks like we're waiting on 2 more signatures. So tomorrow we actually will be extending that by a few $1 million, which is kind of exciting. So a lot of interest there, but like I said, very very early stage. Our team is roughly 20 people. We have a fantastic group of mostly engineers. We just launched with customers. So our sales team is 2 people, and obviously Jeff, you are managing that as well as our customer support there. So we're a small group that still wears many hats, but exciting to be in the stage of now having it in people's hands.
2 questions is what are you looking at from a CEO perspective for how to guide a company through this? But then also kind of secondly, what are you thinking for you personally? How is your life probably going to change? What are some new technologies that excite you outside of quality, outside of the business? So maybe kind of those 2 things. What do you see from a CEO hat? But then what do you see personally going into the future here?
Yeah. So from the CEO perspective, I actually was looking at a great post from, I believe his name's Ethan Mollick, who's a professor for Wharton. And he focuses a lot on the generative AI space. But obviously Wharton, business school is where he's teaching. He had a great post today about organizations today need to be rewriting and reorganizing the tree, right? We're all talking about AI, but if we're not actually figuring out how to change your organization based on that, by the time the newer tools come out, you're going to be irrelevant, right? And so the latest one that I actually just am exploring today is how can we leverage AI not just as this, hey, help me write an email, because that's not actually changing our organization, right? That's helping people be efficient, sure. But AI is getting to the point where actually we need to think about it differently. We need to think about it as, can AI be treated as another team member rather than as a tool for team members, which is a totally different mind shift. And obviously there's a lot you have to do there with that. But it can start doing a lot of the work for us. It can also start helping us think about things in different ways. And what does that mean organizationally on how we are set up? So there's that aspect of it, with the obvious side of, everything in product is changing with AI, and we need to be leveraging that to have the best experience possible for our customers. And then on the personal level, there's a lot there. I've been excited about AI and VR and robotics for a long time. My family gets sick of me talking about it. It's kind of fun to see, though, a lot of the predictions that were so outlandish are starting to happen, and they're happening faster than I thought they would rather than slower, which is awesome, because I feel like normally it would be the other way around. And it is, if you'd asked me a year ago, my answer would have been very different. With how fast things have changed in the past year, GPT-3 was incredible. And for most people, oh, ChatGPT, that's so cool. That was the big leap. And it was very cool. But for me, the leap from GPT-3 to 4 actually feels bigger than 2 to 3. And I know many people would disagree with me on that. But the level of quality hitting the point where I actually believe it can do better than people in a lot of things, or now having the vision capability, I think that's going to totally transform things. I think that AI over the next decade is going to be incorporated into most things. My wife and I were talking yesterday, and she was saying, the smart home should finally be smart. Where it says, hey, what was the example? She used a great example yesterday. I wish I could remember it. But where your fridge is saying, hey, I noticed you're getting low on eggs. I'm just going to add those to your shopping cart here. And the season's changing here. Let me, like an actually smart home that's thinking for you, right? And that's just that piece, right? You add that to robotics. There was an interesting article recently saying that robotics is about to have its GPT moment, right? And where you now have AI that's smart enough to be the brain of the robot, the hardware's already there. I would be absolutely shocked if 10 years from now most people are doing their own laundry. I honestly think, if you think of how the aristocracy lived a couple hundred years ago with servants that had things for them, I think the average American will likely have something like that, where you can assume like, hey, at 5 p.m. dinner's going to be ready. We can come and sit down and have this healthy meal. And if I want to cook, I can, but generally it's prepared for me and the dishes are done for me, and I don't have to worry about that. And I can focus on my personal time with my family. Isn't now, spent trying to catch up on all of these things, is spent with my family. I think that's going to change our personal lives in ways that we're not anticipating. I think it's going to be increasingly focused on experiences together. And I have hopes that AI will help with the, we'll say, social media problem. So there's a lot on the personal side there, whether it's my personal life or my career, that is going to be changed by all of this. And I think the faster it changes, the harder that's going to be to predict.
Couldn't agree with you more. Um, One last question that I just want to ask anybody or everybody that we meet with is, what is like a side project that you've worked on that you're really proud of, or a side project that you would work on if you had the bandwidth?
Uh, Woodwork on is an easier one right now. Not a lot of bandwidth for side projects. Um, yeah, the problem is I have a huge list of things that I'd love to be working on. Uh, one of the things that I want to do in the future that is maybe the most outlandish of them is the theme park that I want to work on. I want to actually build a theme park. I think Disney provides such an incredible thing for people, um, and that popularity is growing, and it's not meeting demand anymore, and other things. But I feel like in the 50s and 60s, when Disneyland was new, it was this incredible, innovative thing that was an experience you couldn't get elsewhere. And I think Disney, while still incredible, and they do make the best experiences for many things, I think that they haven't adapted to the new world in the way that I think is possible. I would love to make a theme park that really opens some new experiences. We'll say I won't go into all of the details on that, but that would be probably where I would be spending my time.
Agreed. And speaking to that, I think that where Disney winds up becoming slow is because they also rely so much on nostalgia. And you can't change things if you also rely on nostalgia. So, you have to keep some things because the fans want that. Well, that means you can't
Yeah,
change it, which means
it's a
that,
small world.
it's going to eventually become outdated. That's right, exactly. But where you're talking, you're going to be relying a lot less on the nostalgia aspect and much more on the experience aspect, which that can be much more molded, and I'm very excited about that in the future. Um, Peter, thank you so much. Hearing your story, it's funny. I've even heard some things that I didn't know. I didn't know that you once threatened to go into insurance. I will never forget that. That's fantastic.
Yeah, I mean,
But really
never
appreciate
would have
you,
worked.
and thank you for joining me on this. No, 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 no. It would not have worked at all. You would have been there 2 days.
Yeah,
Um,
yeah,
but couldn't thank you enough for hopping on the podcast, and looking forward to seeing you tomorrow at the office.
yeah. Thank you. Appreciate it. See you, Jeff.